How are we doing today? We're just about to come to an end to the survey of pre-20th century Christian ethics. And as you can tell by reading and trying to follow some of the things that I discuss, this is an extremely complex history. And the best we can do is probably going to be considered an oversimplification, but in a sense you have to simplify anytime you do this kind of history of ideas. And you have to generalize, but at least one educator says that one of the primary purposes of education is to learn how to generalize properly. So we have been doing that. And we've gotten up to, in our reading, the 19th century philosophical ethics. Now this is the time at which Christian ethics begins to diverge. Actually, this starts in the 18th century and in the Enlightenment, but it carries on through the 19th century. Christian ethics begins to diverge in Western thought from what would eventually become more of a secular ethic based on reason. Now, we've indicated before, and I just need to say it again, that since we cannot really go into in depth for all of the Christian ethics, we're not going to be able to go in depth in some of the alternatives to Christian ethics. That would be something. Okay. That would be something that you would do in a more general course in ethics. But since this ethics course is entitled Christianity and Ethics, I guess people will just have to pardon me for focusing on Christianity and its impact on ethics. And Christianity cannot be, some Christians throughout history have tried to meld Christianity and various European philosophies. And these days, some people are trying to meld Christianity with other Eastern philosophies. But Christianity, in a sense, stands on its own as a unique ethic. Every ethic is unique in a certain way, but it's unique in the sense that the modern world calls for a rationally based ethic. And you can understand why the modern world calls for a rationally based ethic, because of the triumph of the Enlightenment and the triumph of science. Christianity no longer has the upper hand, so to speak, in its influence on culture and its influence on politics or on social life. And so, in a sense, Christianity has started becoming and may continue to become a minority position in Western culture and a more secular view of the nature of humanity. It has begun its ascendancy. In fact, it may have reached its height in ascendancy in the 20th century, and it may be losing out, not necessarily to traditional Christian ethics, but to other kinds of spirituality. Spirituality is one of the buzzwords today that can mean almost anything. But one thing that seems to have happened, not only in popular thought, religious thought, and even in the development of certain postmodernist ways of looking at things, is that the kind of hegemony of rational thought and of scientific thought may be beginning to lose out. In that kind of circumstance, Christian ethics becomes a part of a pluralistic situation. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church was never as all-encompassing and all-powerful and all-influential as we sometimes think it is, because all the way through Christian history there have been alternatives, even in Europe, not only to Christianity, but alternatives to Christian alternatives to Roman Catholicism. So it's never been just a totally uniform picture. For instance, one of the chapters that we didn't emphasize very much, but I'd like to talk about a little bit, is the radical Reformation. We talked about the part of the Reformation which is sometimes called the magisterial Reformation. That is the mainline Reformation of Martin Luther and John Calvin. But these aren't the only folks that were batting around during the Reformation. In fact, there were a number of Christian groups that were considered to be much too radical in their Reformation tendencies for Martin Luther and John Calvin. And these people are sometimes called the left wing of the Reformation. And the left wing of the Reformation has had a pretty important impact on the history of Western Christian ethics. Even though the religious groups that made up the left-wing Reformation have not grown, by their very nature they are sectarian and withdraw from the world. They are, for instance, absolutely pacifist, and therefore their people do not participate generally in the governmental structures of the countries where they live. They don't become policemen. They try to withdraw even from social kind of pressures such as public schools and public kinds of welfare and so forth. And so, and some of these people still exist, and there are churches in the United States who are so absolutely independent in their understanding of Christian ethics that they live in this country, but they are not of this country. That is, they do not participate in, none of their people ever draw welfare or some of them don't even attend public schools and so forth, because from their perspective they are trying to restore or reinstitute New Testament Christianity. And New Testament Christianity from their perspective is pacifist. It does not participate in war. It does not participate in the worldliness of modern culture. Now, even though the particular religious groups that came out of the left-wing Reformation did not grow very fast as bodies, they did leave a great deal of influence in Christianity. For instance, one of the smallest groups in America are the Quakers. And yet the Quakers have had a tremendous impact on the history of American society and American ethics. Without the Quakers, for instance, you can't understand a great deal of the Christian vision that influenced some of earliest American history, particularly as they had influence from their circle in Pennsylvania. As I indicated last time, the Quakers in Pennsylvania had an incredible history of peaceableness, even with the Native Americans that were in Pennsylvania. And that story is not told very often. We all know the story of how European kind of people came over and decimated Native Americans and oppressed them and all that kind of thing. But there was a form of Christian ethics which was really amazing in Pennsylvania and other places, where some of these left wing of the Reformation types actually had extremely peaceable relationships with Native Americans and with everybody else. Sometimes the hardest people to have peace with for the Quakers were the other Christians who looked down on them and considered them to be weird and and nonconforming, and they certainly were nonconforming. But on the other hand, the Quakers have had a tremendous influence on social reform in the history of America. A great many of the white leaders in the abolition of slavery and in the more recent civil rights movement were Quakers. And Quakers still have a very large part in all of the remaining anti-war movements. Anti-war movements don't make very much noise these days because the Vietnam War is over and we're not worried about that anymore. And the wars that we do carry on are wars in which we have such surgical kinds of weapons that very few Americans get killed, and so we don't think very much anymore about being ideologically anti-war. But the left wing of the Reformation still has a great deal of input into those ideas. They never have triumphed. The left wing of the Reformation, Christian pacifism, has never managed to prevent Americans going to war. But they have been a witness against kinds of war and kinds of violence which they consider to be anti-Christian. In the in the Enlightenment period, as I indicated last time, there were a number of people who still considered themselves to be Christians. At least they considered themselves to be theists or believers in God, who drifted away from what might be called Orthodox or classical Christianity, but still maintained most of the basic ideas of classical Christianity, and they certainly maintained most of the basic ethical ideals. Except now, in response to a more enlightened, quote, a more enlightened understanding of the nature of human beings, these folks decided that you really didn't need revelation to tell you how to be good. You didn't need revelation to tell you what to do. And so they attempted to develop ethics based on reason. Now, there are several things that we probably need to say in response to that. One is that creates one of the major problems in the division between Christianity and modern secular culture, is the loss of the interest or the belief in or the consideration of the concept of revelation. Revelation is one of the more unpopular ideas in secular culture. And it's obvious why it would be an unpopular idea. If you do not believe that God really has anything to do with your individual life or your social life or your political life, then any announcement or any affirmation that there has been some revelation from God is going to be a kind of a foreign thing in your public discussion. And right now in America, there's a great deal of discussion going on about how much religious thought should be allowed to be in the public square, as it said. How much should we allow religious talk to be in public discussions, such as political campaigns and so forth. The problem is that a lot of people think that that's not proper, which is, of course, understandable in our pluralistic situation. Some people think that it should even be illegal, that it's unconstitutional. But that's a kind of a stretch because, for instance, when Joseph Lieberman, in running for vice president, made a point, which is very important to him, that his ethical perspective is based on his religious worldview. That may not be a public ethic. That may not be a public way of looking at things. But Joseph Lieberman still had no hesitancy in making those statements, and he would make them again. Because as an Orthodox Jew, he understands the pluralistic situation in America, but he also understands that people are just blowing smoke when they say that his statements are unconstitutional. Because you can separate church from state, but you can't separate human beings from their religious perspective. You can't separate human beings from their religious perspective or from the fact that they base their ethics in their religious perspective. Now, in order to have a pluralistic society, a secular society, a society which is not under the hegemony of any particular religious group, you have to kind of come to a public ethic that is largely secular. But how is that public ethic arrived at? In other words, how do you come to a synthesis of a public ethic for a secular pluralistic society? Some people assume that the way you should do it is simply on the basis of secular reason. Other people, certain people who come out of certain religious traditions, for instance, Supreme Court justices who come out of the Roman Catholic tradition, say that there is no constitutional way in which you can enforce Roman Catholic ethical doctrine on the United States, but they say there is still something that is called natural law, which Roman Catholics adhere to, but since it is natural law, they also assume that it should be agreeable to lots of other people to adhere to natural law, since it does not come from revelation, or it does not come from purely religious doctrine. It is discerned in the nature of things. And there have been lots of people in American history who had some kind of concept of natural law, whether it was Roman Catholic concept or whether it was the Enlightenment concept, because there was a lot of natural law still bouncing around in the Enlightenment. And a statement, for instance, like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. If you look for the source of that idea historically, you might argue that it comes from positive Christian doctrine. But if you don't want to make that connection, you at least have to understand that it comes from a concept of natural law in which God guarantees what is right and what is wrong. So it cannot be justified or based in a completely secular view of the world. But it is a view that kind of crosses all denominational barriers. And so Jefferson was quite open to any person of any religion participating in the American Republic. In fact, he was, I assume, open to atheists participating in the American Republic. But he was not really personally open to the idea that there could really be an American Republic if there were not some God-given natural laws upon which the Republic could be based. But when we talk about Christian ethics, we're talking about how Christian ethics impacts upon these ideas of natural law, how Christian ethics impacts upon the idea of the American Republic. In fact, some sociologists have talked about the religion of the Republic as being a kind of a synthesis of Jewish, Christian, and other ideas. But you have to have some, from their perspective, you have to have some kind of ethical center for a republic, for a citizenship. It just cannot be denominationally particular. So anyway, even today, when we're trying to figure out what to do socially and politically, for instance, what to do with the welfare system, where in the world did the welfare system come from? Is the welfare system viable or is it not viable? Well, the American welfare system is a secular production based on largely Puritan ideas of community and of commonwealth. Obviously, it doesn't, the welfare system doesn't operate like Puritans would have liked it to operate, but it still owes its existence in a certain way to this way of looking at the world. That is the Judeo-Christian way of looking at the world, as mediated primarily through a Puritan perspective. That is, that you cannot have a commonwealth without taking into consideration the good, including the welfare. Welfare used to be not a bad word in America. You know, people were supposed to be concerned about the public welfare. And that's the only reason why our welfare system was named that, because it was a good word at one time. But it has since become kind of a bad word. But the fact of the matter is that even in a presidential debate, neither Republicans nor Democrats can get away with opposing welfare. The only thing they can do, because of this religious background in America, the only thing they can do is argue about how is the best way to administer welfare. The abolition of welfare as we know it is what is the way Clinton put it, and some of the Republicans put it. So welfare is a situation that developed in America out of, frankly, Jewish and Christian sensibilities. And in the same way, a modern ethic that will make sense to all Americans will certainly have to include some Jewish Christian sensibilities. As our population becomes more pluralistic, it's going to have to include some other sensibilities too. But you're not going to be able to say, okay, starting right now, let's just not even talk about religion and religious ideas and religious ethics. Let's just develop an ethic that's based completely on human reason. Well, that position is a very small minority in America. Although when a person holds that position, sometimes they think that is the only proper position for Americans to hold. Well, so that means you have a marketplace of ideas in America still. And so someone can certainly argue that American ethics should be totally secular and totally rationalistic. But he or she's going to have to compete within the public mindset for that idea. And it's probably going to be very difficult to happen. For instance, we now have millions of Muslim citizens in the United States, and they're certainly not going to come over here and just jump at the chance of sending their children to learn secular ethics. You know, they're just not going to do that. In fact, that's one thing that makes some Muslims very to have some trepidation about even sending their children to our public schools. Down to the bottom line, because we are just about to end our historical survey and start looking at our book by Paul Ramsey on basic Christian ethics. In other words, we're going into a more theological study rather than a historical study. But as we do so, we have to understand why the importance of talking about all of this stuff. The importance of talking about all of this stuff is that when we start talking about Christian ethics, we're not going to be attempting to elaborate secular ethics. We're going to be attempting to elaborate Christian ethics. And Christian ethics are not based in reason, and they're not based in any kind of secular ideology. And so nobody should kind of get upset that in a course in Christian ethics we're actually going to try to understand Christian ethics. We're not going to try to breach the separation of church and state by trying to put particular Christian ethics, particularly not a denominational interpretation of Christian ethics, into law. But we are going to put Christian ethics out there as one of the possibilities that people will run into, and one of the possibilities that people will confront. Because as long as there are Christians in America or any place else, they cannot conscientiously trade Christian ethics for secular ethics. That's just the way it is. So if they participate in the development of a secular or a public ethic, it's going to have to be from their own perspective. They're not going to win every discussion, but at least they're going to have to put in their 2 cents worth, so to speak. Now, we had started looking at 19th century philosophical ethics, and we had mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche. And the reason why it's important to look at these guys is because they are people who were raised in the Europe of the Christian tradition, but they are consciously in opposition to the Christian tradition. They probably cannot completely extricate themselves from the Christian tradition. That's just not sociologically or psychologically possible. And so what they do instead is they set themselves directly in opposition to the Christian position. For instance, if you're doing religious philosophy in Tibet, you don't even have to discuss the religious tradition of Europe. You don't have to discuss the Christian religious tradition. But if you're trying to do even an atheistic ethical position in Europe, you have to do it bouncing off of the Christian tradition. So what will happen then is that your ethics will still retain some of the color of Christian and Jewish ethics, but since it is atheistic, it will also contain a great deal of opposition to Jewish and Christian ethics. And Friedrich Nietzsche was really angry about Christian ethics. He didn't just think, well, they're just not reasonable. He thought that they were anti-life and anti-human. All truly noble reality, he wrote, grows out of triumphant self-affirmation. So Nietzsche is thinking, here is Augustine telling us that self-affirmation is sin. Well, that's not what Augustine said, but that's the way Nietzsche understood him. Yes. Yeah, punch the button.
But isn't Nietzsche the one that came up with that Ubermensch thing, or the ultimate man thing that kind of led into Nazism?
That's a more generalized idea, the Ubermensch. In fact, Nietzsche participated in that idea. But the Ubermensch idea may even be traced to a certain extent back to lots of different German thought, even Luther. But it's the idea that originally it was a religious idea. It was the idea that God has prepared a human being to be our leader, to be our Führer. You know, the word Führer is a word that's found in the German Bible. Who is the Führer in the German Bible? Christ. Christ is our Führer. And there were some Lutheran and other theologians. There's one Lutheran theologian, for instance, during World War II that wrote a book, Christ is my Führer. Because the idea of the Ubermensch, as it developed in German thought in the 20th century, was really put the original idea in a tailspin, so that the Ubermensch, instead of being the development of the true human being by God, it came to be the Nietzschean idea of the human being developing himself, self-affirmation. In fact, lots of liberal Protestants during the rise of Hitler, guys that should have recognized immediately the demonic nature or the anti-Christian nature of Adolf Hitler, didn't recognize it very clearly, because his idea of being the kind of the savior or the redeemer or the rescuer of Christian culture had a resonance with him. It resonated with him. And some of the liberal Protestant theologians before the war had pretty bad reputations after the war that they had to overcome. The real opponents of Hitlerism before and during the war among German theologians were among more Orthodox theologians, including more theologians that were sometimes called neo-Orthodox. Karl Barth, for instance, called anti-Semitism the sin against the Holy Spirit. Whereas some liberal Protestant theologians who had been more influenced by the Enlightenment and the idea of self-affirmation and self-fulfillment took a pretty long time to recognize the horrible nature of Hitlerism. Because now you can't blame Hitler on Nietzsche. I mean, people sometimes try to do that. In fact, in this book, at the end of his discussion of Nietzsche, listen to how this author states it. Nietzsche's philosophy dovetailed rather well with the social Darwinism of the late 19th century. Now, some American Christians in the early part of the 20th century simply said, social Darwinism is Nietzscheism. You know, it's Darwin interpreted by Nietzsche. It's Darwin interpreted by atheism. Well, it's hard to do that. It's hard just to say, you know, Nietzsche is to blame for all of this stuff. But, so he puts it in a delicate way. Nietzsche's philosophy dovetailed rather well with the social Darwinism of the late 19th century, which drew social ethical conclusions from Charles Darwin's theory concerning the survival of the fittest. In other words, Nietzsche wasn't a biologist. He wasn't arguing on the basis of biology. He was arguing on the basis of human nature. That is, that Judaism and Christianity were opposed to human nature. But he goes on to say, and it must be said that his troubled and troubling thoughts anticipated some of the darkest chapters in the history of the 20th century. Now that's kind of tippy-toeing around, because philosophers, and probably rightly so, resent somebody blaming Hitler on Nietzsche, because certainly Nietzsche was not Hitler, and he was not a Hitlerian. So they resent just kind of some direct attribution of Hitler and Nazism to Nietzsche. But you still can say that his troubled and troubling thoughts anticipated some of the darkest chapters in the history of the 20th century. He doesn't even mention Nazism. But self-affirmation, as opposed to affirmation of God, that is, the goodness of man as a gift from God versus the goodness of man as an inherent quality, whether there's a God or not. That's where the split took place between secular and Christian ethics. So for Nietzsche, he's very angry at Augustine, I think because he doesn't understand him, but for a lot of other reasons. Very angry at Augustine for, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, almost identifying self-affirmation with sin. And here he goes on again to say some things that you see reflected again in Freud and other people that come out of the same culture. The church fights passion with excision in every sense. Now you remember I was talking about how the concept of the impassibleness of God was inserted into Christian thought from Greek thought. Well, I have a thesis, and some of the philosophers around here may argue with it, but I'll still put it forward. That is, that what Nietzsche and people like him are fighting against is not really the Christian view, but it's the Greek view that has inserted itself into Christianity. And yet their self-conception is that they are almost reviving the Greek view in opposition to Christianity. At least they're reviving a secularist or an anti-Christian view in opposition to Christianity. So the church fights passion. And Nietzsche didn't want to fight passion. He wanted passion to just kind of bubble up and express itself. Now notice, its practice, its cure is castratism. In other words, the way Christians want ethics to play itself out in human life is through castration. Well, you can go back in Christian history and pick up some ideas and some things that are said in Christian history that seem to indicate that Christianity is more in favor of castrating someone than allowing him to have sex. And that's kind of the thing that Nietzsche and Freud and a lot of people reacted against. For instance, you even have the personal episode in the life of Origen. If you know anything about Origen, one of the great Christian intellects, who actually physically castrated himself in order to try to avoid temptation. Unfortunately, he didn't know enough about medicine to know that that wouldn't help him to avoid temptation, but he went ahead and did it anyway. But the reason why Origen castrated himself evidently was that he read a saying of Jesus as if Jesus was a Neoplatonist or a Gnostic, and so took him literally. Jesus said there are some people who become eunuchs for the kingdom of God. Well, Jesus wasn't saying, that people need to castrate themselves. He wasn't even promoting monasticism. And Jesus also said, it's better to go into the kingdom of God without a hand than it is to go into hell with a hand or with an eye or with, in other words, it's better to get rid of some part of your body. Well, if you read Jesus as if he were a Gnostic or a Manichae, then you might dig your eye out. But the New Testament understands that just because you put your eyes out does not mean that you are therefore no longer, it's no longer possible to tempt you. That's not what he was saying. So in a sense, when this Manichaean, Neoplatonic concept of passion, God doesn't have any passion, and the ultimate goal of human beings is to suppress their passion. When that entered into Christianity, then in a sense, Christianity was setting itself up for the reaction of Nietzsche and Freud and other people. Notice this, the church never asks, how can one spiritualize, beautify, deify a craving? Well, that's true. The church does not ask, how do you deify a craving? But that's not because the church believes that a craving is evil. In other words, Augustine would agree that deifying a craving would be sin. That would be idolatry. But that's not because a craving is evil. Nietzsche and Freud kind of got the idea. I guess they may have got it from their nannies or something, but they kind of got the idea that in Christianity, sexual and other kinds of natural impulses were somehow evil. In other words, in order to understand Nietzsche and Freud, you have to read or have to know their biography. One of the things you have to know about Freud's biography is that he was of Jewish background, but he had a Roman Catholic nanny. And that has something to do with the way his life develops. So Freud doesn't just wake up one morning and start thinking rationally. He actually is thinking out of his whole biographical experience. And so is Nietzsche. And evidently Nietzsche was well acquainted with Christians for whom the expression castratism might properly apply. Christianity never asked about the deifying of cravings, but it does affirm that cravings are good, but that they must be disciplined and that they must not become idolatrous. So he says the church is an attack on the roots of passion, and therefore it's an attack on the roots of life. This is a part of the more generalized romantic movement, romantic reaction. It's hard to use the term romantic, for instance, in describing Nietzsche or even describing Hitler, but in a sense, they touch the romantic movement because what they want to do is to revive the primacy of passion. So the practice of the church is hostile to life. Now the interesting thing is that since Nietzsche, the church and Nietzsche have been throwing accusations at each other because from the perspective of the Roman Catholic Church, Nietzsche is hostile to life. And a lot of secularism is hostile to life. So even the Roman Catholic Church, in its official teachings, is not as castrating as Nietzsche evidently experienced Christianity. What? Nietzsche? I really don't know what his religion was when he was raised. It probably had to either be Roman Catholic or Lutheran. Hitler was Roman Catholic. He was baptized Roman Catholic. And he never told anybody that he wasn't a Roman Catholic. But if you study his biography, you realize that he was not Roman Catholic and he was not Christian. He was Roman Catholic only in name, but his basic worldview was blood and soil, German paganism. His favorite musician was Wagner, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that, except that if you understand what Wagner is saying in his music, he is glorifying German paganism. Now you can glorify German paganism. In fact, I can go to a Wagner opera and enjoy it because I'm learning something. But if you actually actualize German paganism in your own personal ethic, then you come up with lots of Hitler's friends, because that's what they were doing. Hitler, in fact, prayed just in order to fly his pagan flag. Hitler prayed to a German goddess. But in his public life, he offered himself as a defender of Christian civilization. and even tried to convert the church in Germany to Nazism. And a lot of them were almost converted, and they called themselves the German Christians. And some of these German Christians bit on some of the older German propaganda, such as that Jesus was a German. You know, how can you have the anti-Semitic perspective that Nazism had if you realize fully and accept fully that Jesus was a Jew? That's what Barth meant by anti-Semitism, is the sin against the Holy Spirit. How can you be an anti-Semite if you're a Christian who takes seriously the fact that Jesus was a Jew, and that all of the early followers of Jesus were Jewish, and that Jesus' basic ethic was Jewish? And so, since Hitler and Nazism and his predecessors were anti-Jewish ethic, they were also anti-Jewish, anti-Semite. And these two things kind of feed into each other. You know, which came first, the chicken or the head, or chicken or the egg? Are you anti-Jewish and then become opposed to Jewish ethics, or are you opposed to Jewish ethics and then become anti-Jewish? Or is it a very complex thing that includes all kinds of ramifications? And I think it's probably the latter. But anyway, Nietzsche goes on to say, what is bad? That sounds like, you know, what is my ethic? What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. An expression used by Nietzscheans and later by Freudians is the servile ethics of Judaism. Now, Hitler was just as opposed to Christianity as Nietzsche was. He just didn't own up to it. But if you tried to destroy all the Christians, you wouldn't have anybody to fight. In other words, you wouldn't have an army. So Hitler could not embark on a plan of trying to destroy all the Christians. He embarked on a plan of trying to convert the Christians to German paganism. And the things that he, from his perspective, most demonstrated how Christianity was still too dependent on Judaism were things like the defense of the weak, the defense and the preservation, for instance, of the mentally retarded. This was opposed to two very strong ethics in which Nazism participated. One is social Darwinism, and the other is German paganism. The weak is the evil. And so if you already know just by romantic intuition that being mentally retarded is repulsive and unacceptable, then you add to that the social Darwinist scientific conclusion that being mentally retarded is opposition to life. It's opposition to evolution. Then you've got two or three reasons why you can justify the euthanasia of mentally retarded people. And that kind of thing is what first really clued some Lutheran theologians into the demonic nature of Hitlerism. people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other folks. We need to look at Søren Kierkegaard. In Søren Kierkegaard, we have a Danish Lutheran theologian who is sometimes called the father of existentialism. Kierkegaard was, from the perspective of more recent Christian theologians, a kind of a Christian prophet. He was very critical and very hard on the Danish church in which he had been raised. He considered the Danish church to be unchristian because the Danish church was tied up with the state, and therefore tied up with power, and therefore tied up with wealth and money. And from his perspective, a Danish clergyman was the representative of almost the opposite of Christianity. Because if you believe in Christianity and don't actually actualize it in your life, then you shouldn't continue to call yourself a Christian. And so if you are a Danish clergyman, or if you're the Danish church, and you're basically the upper class of Danish life, and you're the defender of upper class prerogatives, you're actually the justifier of oppression, then how can you call yourself Christian? So Kierkegaard was not very popular among his fellow church members. And he was so radical, in fact, that he couldn't really be friends with anybody. But his radicalness was a passion, just like Nietzsche's opposition to Christianity was a passion. Søren Kierkegaard's opposition to the Christian elite was a passion. In other words, whereas Nietzsche was opposed to the Christian elite because he thought they were castrators, Kierkegaard was opposed to the Christian elite because he thought that they had no Christian passion, that they did not actually actualize the Christian perspective in their own lives and therefore in their society and in the state. But they instead became what sociologists would call the guarantor of the status quo. And for Kierkegaard, just like the Hebrew prophets, the status quo, even the religious status quo, is never the will of God. The will of God always stands over against the status quo, including the religious status quo. And that's the sense in which Jesus also was in the prophetic tradition. He not only did not get along with the religious status quo, but he infuriated. And so Kierkegaard infuriated Christians, including the clergy of Denmark. The burden of Kierkegaard's struggle is the actualization of the self in existence. He was also reacting against Hegel, who in a sense was his teacher. And he reacted against Hegel because Hegel was basically an essentialist. You know, if you want, it's hard to define existentialism. Back when I was in college, existentialism was the buzzword. I don't know if people talk about existentialism much anymore. But we always were trying to find out how you define existentialism. And the answer was always, you can't define existentialism. Because defining something is essentialism. In other words, Hegel, in that sense, is an essentialist philosopher. He's trying to get down and try to understand the essence of things. In that sense, he's in the Platonic Aristotelian tradition. He's an essentialist philosopher. And from Kierkegaard's perspective, it is absurd to be an essentialist philosopher. That is like standing outside your own skin and looking down and trying to understand yourself. That's like standing on some Archimedean point and looking down at reality and describing it. So Kierkegaard didn't like philosophers. He was a philosopher himself, but he's more of a theologian, and he didn't like philosophers because philosophers never got to the point where they could really be Christians. They were always trying to find out rationally what the essence of things were. They were trying to find out who God was. And since human beings can never find out who God is, if they spend their whole lives doing that, they will never come to the point where they can be Christians. In other words, you can't really believe in God in the Christian sense, according to Kierkegaard, as long as you're trying to study Him, or as long as you're trying to prove He exists. If you wait to prove God exists before you believe in Him, not going to happen. So in that sense, he's also taking seriously Hume and Kant. But in taking seriously Hume and Kant, he's taking seriously two secularized Christians. Hume was a Calvinist, and you have to understand his biography to understand his philosophy. Kant was a Lutheran. You have to understand his biography to understand his philosophy. And one of the conclusion that Kant and Hume both came to was that you could not prove the existence of God by reason. And a lot of people think, wow, that's a new idea. But that's the same thing Luther believed. Luther was not a philosopher, but he was an existentialist. And so you cannot understand, so we need to try to define existentialism a little bit if we're going to call Luther an existentialist. But in a sense, existentialism is an in-depth presentation of some of the basic ideas that arise out of the Christian biblical view of reality, the Christian view of God and the Christian view of the nature of human beings. Now, when we were studying existentialism in the 60s, most people assumed that existentialism was an atheistic philosophy. And the reason why they did is because the best-known existentialists at the time were Sartre, Camus, and Samuel Beckett. And so if you read Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot has been put on at least a time or two here at the University of Houston. If you ever get a chance to see it, you probably ought to see what people when I went to college were all up in the air about. Atheistic existentialism. Because atheistic existentialism seemed to be the real deal. It seemed to be the only really honest way of confronting reality, confronting existence. And so it wasn't until a little later that I discovered that there have only been atheistic existentialists for a short period of time in terms of the history of existentialism. That all of the original existentialists were Christian theologians. Now, how does that make sense? It's still true that some of the best preachers in the Christian church are the most avid readers of atheistic existentialist poetry and drama, because if you know an existentialistic atheistic drama, such as The Death of a Salesman, you have half your sermon. Because half your sermon is going to tell you, this was half of Kierkegaard's sermon, Half of Kierkegaard's sermon, and a lot of most modern preachers today, even Billy Graham, has been influenced by Kierkegaard through people like Karl Barth and Martin Buber and so forth, even though they may never have read Kierkegaard. But half of their sermon is atheistically existential. That is, they show that there is no meaning in history, that you cannot derive meaning from history. And you cannot derive meaning from human existence itself. History has to be given meaning. Human existence has to be given meaning. So an existentialist would say, our ordinary idea is that if a person is not living a very fulfilling life, we say, he's not living, he's just existing. Well, an existentialist would say it the other way around. He's not existing, he's just living. Because existing takes effort. Existing means that living, just living, which is what Kierkegaard calls the aesthetic level, just living means that you're like a football fan. You know, you're like a 70 or 80-year-old football fan sitting up in the stadium watching a football game going on down on the football field. And so your participation in that football game can be interesting, but it's not the same thing as being down on the football field. And so for an existentialist, almost all of whom originally were Christian theologians, life on the aesthetic level or life on the just living level is like sitting in the football stadium observing life. That's what Kierkegaard thought Hegel was doing, just kind of sitting in the football stadium trying to describe life instead of actually being there and living it. He was trying to comprehend essence instead of existing. So to profess beliefs, such as to profess beliefs is not the same thing as to believe in them. To believe in them means to actually actualize them in your life. Over the last 20 years, in fact, I've heard lots of different preachers, including Billy Graham. And Billy Graham, and these days, Pentecostal preachers, preachers all over the place, talk about the leap of faith. The leap of faith is the second half of the sermon. The first half of the sermon is that history has no meaning in itself. And you tell the story of the death of the salesman, and you tell the story of waiting for Godot, and you see that history and human life, human existence has no meaning within itself. You can't find meaning there. But the difference between the atheistic existentialists of the 20th century and the Christian existentialists of the 19th and 20th century is that the Christian existentialist has a second half of the sermon. Even though you cannot find meaning in history or in existence, there is meaning in history and existence because it is given by God. And that's what requires the leap of faith. Now, the existentialist also has a leap of faith. But for Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is the leap into the arms of God. If you're an atheist, you're not going to be leaping into the arms of God. So what does the leap of faith have to be if you're an atheistic existentialist? You just have to have you have to have the courage to exist. In a sense, you have to create your own meaning. You have to create your meaning for your own existence. You have to create your own meaning for history. So in that sense, existentialist atheists were conceived to be the most heroic of atheists because they were consistent in their atheism. Some atheists still see meaning in history and still see meaning in human existence. An atheistic existentialist says, where do you see that? And so an atheistic existentialist says that you need to just have the courage to confront the fact that there is no meaning and then kind of take a leap of faith to live as though there were meaning. Kierkegaard says, in fact he says it before the atheistic existentialists do, that there is no meaning in history, and the reason why he says it is because he's a Lutheran theologian, and that's what Luther believed. There is no meaning in history. There is no intrinsic value in human existence. The value of human existence is given by God. The meaning in human existence is given by God. So it's very simple to tell the difference between an atheistic existentialist and a theistic existentialist. But from Kierkegaard's perspective, sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference between people who call themselves Christians and atheists, because they really haven't actualized their faith in their lives and in their existence. So Kierkegaard is operating, he's operating theologically. He's considered a philosopher, but he's operating theologically. And from his perspective, you simply have to eventually get back to God. And you have to take a leap of faith into the arms of God, because you cannot establish him rationally or philosophically. So from that perspective, a contemporary Christian or Jewish theologian can look back at the history of Christianity and Judaism and, for instance, say, well, have you read Job? We talk about existentialism beginning with Kierkegaard. Have you read Job? Have you read Augustine? Have you read Luther? The existential approach to the world does not begin in the 18th century or in the 19th century. Now, the atheistically existential view of the world doesn't come along until the 20th century, 19th, 20th century. But the religious existential view of the world is a mainstream in Jewish and Christian theology. Now, does that make sense to anybody? I mean, you understand what I'm trying to say? When I first went to college, the atheistic existentialists in America were represented by several authors, but also represented by a kind of a superficial atheistic existentialism called the beatniks. And the first girl that I met when I went to college was a beatnik. And she was beautiful. And she invited me up to her dorm room. And I thought, man, I have hit luck. But when I got into her dorm room, it was decorated like a beatnik would decorate their room. And she was always talking in ways that depressed me. So we never developed a very good relationship. I kind of led her to believe that I was a beatnik. You know, guys sometimes do that kind of thing. But But it didn't last very long, because even as beautiful as she was, and the fact that she was interested in me was even more existentially amazing. As beautiful as she was, I wanted to go out and live. I didn't want to. I didn't want to sit around listening to beat poetry. But of course, beat poetry, real beat poetry and beat literature is really profound stuff. Like I say, if you're a good preacher these days, you have read it and studied it in seminary, because it gives you the first half of your sermon. This is the situation the world is in. This is the situation you're in. In that sense, Jonathan Edwards was an existentialist in his sermon on the sinners in hands of an angry God, where the spider is being dangled over the fire. That's an existentialist view of what the world would be like without God, without God's grace, without God's goodness. But Jonathan Edwards says it's not that way. You can take the leap of faith into God's arms. He didn't use that kind of expression, but in a sense, then you can chase existentialism through Jonathan Edwards, just like you can Luther and Augustine and so forth. And there's a sense in which Plato is more existentialist than some later rationalists. Not to choose, according to Kierkegaard, is ultimately to have others choose for one, and thereby to lose oneself. Does that sound familiar? If you have junior high kids sometime during your life who you have to send out into our modern school system, basically they are going to be on Kierkegaard's aesthetic level. In other words, they are going to have everything chosen by others. You send them off to junior high and they come back something you've never seen before. And therefore losing oneself. Kierkegaard suggests that the content of the choice, the thing chosen, is secondary to the fact of choice itself. Now this would be something that more rational ethicists, even Christian ethicists, would have a problem with, but because they would say, well, it does make a difference what choice you make and so forth. But Kierkegaard is trying to emphasize the importance of choice. In a sense, it's similar to what I said before about the T-shirt I have that has a picture of Luther on the front, and it says, "Sin boldly, but believe more boldly." In other words, you haven't got time to get yourself straightened out before you take the leap of faith. You haven't got time to get yourself straightened out before you act ethically or even religiously. You haven't got that long to live. So it's better to choose wrongly than not to choose at all. Not to choose is to surrender one's personhood. To choose, even though wrongly, is to open oneself to the possibilities of correction. And that's the interesting dynamic in Christian ethics. Not being a rationalist ethic, you do not have to wait for a philosopher to determine what's right for you to do. You make your choice, and then if it's kind of off base a little bit, you have the theological critique by which to correct it. Sin boldly and believe more boldly. That results, of course, in Christian ethics having lots of disagreements within itself about what's right about this or that or the other. So you can have Christian ethicists who are absolute pacifists, Christian ethicists who believe in just war, Christian ethicists who believe in revolution. But the point of all of these ethics is don't just sit there, do something. You can't just be the guarantor and the protector of the status quo, either for your own life or for the life of your community or the life of the state. Okay, does anybody have anything you'd like to pursue about any of that? If you want to read, this may have been the first time you've heard the fact that all of the original existentialists were religious existentialists. But if you want to read some good literature, more contemporary, that is in the tradition of Kierkegaard, you need to read Martin Buber, for instance, who is a Jewish existentialist theologian. Paul Tillich has a lot of influences in him, but one of the primary ones is existentialism. And if you read Paul Ramsey or any modern Christian ethicist. All right, that's it. We'll see you next time.